Welcome to Seminars at Steamboat. I'm Joella West, Seminars Chair. We're glad you're joining us today as we continue the season with a compelling talk in a subject area that we addressed in 2018 and 2020, but every year something new and scary seems to happen to keep it top of mind. Seminars at Steamboat. One of the things that makes our events so special and which our guests appreciate is the audience questions. As you listen to the talk, we encourage you to participate in the Q&A by posting questions in the chat, which appears at the bottom of your screen. Although we're watching on our webpage, the chat works exactly like Zoom. While we're on the subject of our website, we hope you'll take some time to read more about this season's speakers, view past events, including last week's presentation by Governor Deval Patrick, and perhaps make a donation. If you missed part of today's talk or would like to view it again or recommend it to friends, it will be posted later this week. All of our recorded events this season will be captioned on our website, so please share this with anyone you know who can benefit from that feature. You can also find us on Facebook and Instagram, and KUNC Community Radio of Northern Colorado will also have this season's talks available on their website at kunc.org's Seminars Podcast landing page. For 18 plus years, we've made our nonpartisan events free to the public. Much of the work to produce our seasons is done by our volunteer board, but the rest is made possible by donations. If you are already a contributor, thank you. If you're thinking about clicking on the donate button on our website right now, please go ahead. I'll wait. Thanks so much. And special thanks to today's sponsors, Gary and Holly Nelson. If you signed up for our friend's virtual Zoom dinner following the conclusion of this event, please remember to join promptly at 6:45 Mountain Daylight Time by using the link that you received from Seminars over the weekend. Our speaker today is James Bruce, and here to introduce him is board member Gary Nelson.
Last year at Seminars, we heard two fascinating presentations on foreign policy. Dr. Kathleen Hall Jamieson spoke about the Russian cyber attacks on the US election in 2016 and 2020. And Admiral James Stavridis gave an extraordinary assessment of global affairs, including threats to the US, with an emphasis on China. Today, we are delving into the intelligence threat to the US from abroad, and we have the perfect speaker to lead this discussion. Dr. James Bruce has spent his career in intelligence, including 24 years at the CIA. He was chief of counterintelligence training and the deputy national intelligence officer for science and technology. Following the CIA, he spent 12 years at the RAND Corporation, writing and doing research. Jim is the author of numerous articles and reports. He has taught at Georgetown University, Florida Atlantic, the RAND Graduate Institute, and the National War College. Jim also spent 3 years in Colorado, earning his PhD at the University of Denver from the Joseph Corbell School of International Studies. This presentation will be stimulative and informative, and even more so with your questions, as Joella has said. Now we are pleased to welcome Dr. James B. Bruce on the foreign intelligence threat to the US, Russia, China, and other bad actors. Jim?
Thank you, Gary. Thank you very much, and thank you, Joella. Greatly appreciate the kind introduction. I am just delighted to be part of this important seminar series. I should add, I'm also delighted to be back in Colorado, if only virtually. I'd rather do it the other way, but for now, this is the best we can do. The presentation is about the foreign intelligence threat to the United States. Our focus is going to be principally on Russia and China, but we'll make mention of a couple others as well. Let me start here with a caveat. My former employers require that I tell everyone that these are my own views, my personal views, and they don't necessarily represent the views of CIA or the intelligence community or even the RAND Corporation. There's one other caveat I want to add, and that is that in looking over the presentation that I wanted to give, I found that there's just more information in the PowerPoint than the time allowed. So I'm going to skip over some of the slides and put some others on fast forward, and we can come back to those topics in the Q&A if anybody wants to. So let's start here. This is a simple roadmap of where we want to go. We're going to start with threats, and you can see that we're going to go through a few countries and some other topics, and wind up with some key takeaways. So let's start with the issue of foreign threats. One important question is how do we identify what threats are? By we, I mean how does the intelligence community or the United States government identify foreign threats? It's pretty straightforward. Let me define threat first, and that's basically what foreign intelligence services try to get from us. They aim for our classified information, intellectual property, advanced technologies, any information of value. And they do that by targeting government, corporations, and individuals through different means of espionage. This is really important because intelligence can force multiply the threats that come from military and economic and political forces. So there's one important threat document that you should know about in one process. The threat document is called the Annual Threat Assessment. It's prepared by the intelligence community for presentation to Congress. They do that yearly, and typically they're done they're presented actually in February. These are unclassified presentations, but they're always followed up with classified discussions afterward. They focus on the most important threats that the intelligence community anticipates facing in the coming year. There's another process just worth mentioning. It's called the NIPF, or National Intelligence Priorities Framework. This is a process that's run by the Director of National Intelligence in very close coordination with the White House. And what they try to do is to get the White House involved in helping the community select the prioritization for intelligence collection and analysis. So what the intelligence community does is basically be responsive to the priorities from the White House. There's something else that's really important here, and that's that the new threats that we're now facing from cyber attacks. This truly is new, and if you look at the history of revolutions in intelligence, we can go back to really the origins that have to do with spying. That is to say, recruiting spies and classic espionage, which is sometimes referred to, perhaps only humorously, as the second oldest profession. Radio intercept and then signals intelligence followed. That was really at the early part of the 20th century. Then I think what up until cyber, the most important revolution we had in intelligence was space-based collection. Launch satellites in multiple orbits with many sensors, and so we can put satellites in low Earth orbit and geosynchronous, which is to say they stay in the same place all the time in a variety of other orbits, and put a lot of different sensors on them that collect electro-optical. We have radar sensors, infrared sensors, and video. There's a lot of different things they can do with from space. But all of that actually pales in comparison, I think, with the new revolution that we have in cyber attacks. The cyber era has provided extraordinary capabilities to intelligence and really to a lot of other actors that are not technically intelligence services that we've never really seen before. In general, we have to say that cyber weapons have become a real game changer, and I hope the rest of my presentation makes that point clearly. Let me start here with just a comment or two on intelligence and counterintelligence. Basically, intelligence means collecting and analyzing information that we get from abroad. Counterintelligence is countering the foreign intelligence services that target us. And basically what counterintelligence means is catching spies and supporting operations. But increasingly, we have to focus on the topic of how do we counter cyber attacks. And that's a really important issue. I also want to make a quick editorial point that counterintelligence really depends on the kind of governments. Authoritarian governments are sometimes actually referred to as counterintelligence states. Here, counterintelligence plays a major role in keeping dictators in power, which puts a big emphasis on internal security as a major counterintelligence function. Counterintelligence helps these dictators wield vast powers over its citizenry. Democratic states, on the other hand, like the one we live in, substantially limit counterintelligence. They put curbs on it, mainly to protect individual liberties and rights that are laid out in the in the Bill of Rights and the first 10 amendments. The net result basically is that limited counterintelligence means limited counterintelligence effectiveness. So in intelligence and in counterintelligence, dictatorships do have an asymmetric advantage over democracies. A quick point here that the United States has been a very attractive, even lucrative intelligence target for many, many countries. The column in the left shows the cases that were identified and arrested, prosecuted, indicted, and convicted just in that 50-year period. Those are amazing numbers, but they are only really the tip of the iceberg because there are even more cases that we call non-prosecuted cases for a variety of reasons. Our friends and allies that spy against us are listed in the right column, and I will try to return to that subject later in the presentation. The two top threats that we face from foreign intelligence are Russia and China. There's some debate about which is the bigger threat, and I don't think there's consensus on that at the moment. Russia, now headed by Vladimir Putin, who's been in power now really for 21 years, who actually is a former KGB officer, a former intelligence officer in Russia, and he's taken Russia in some directions that have helped maintain its hostility to the United States. So if you take a look at the national security ambitions of Russia, the first thing you can ask is, well, what is the threat from Russia? And the answer, put very briefly, is the threat is selecting our leaders, including president, dividing our society, undermining our democracy and our foreign policy objectives, destroying NATO, and there's even an existential threat from Russia that no other nation really poses in that degree. Putin gave a talk in 2005 where he's made the point the demise of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. Or he just said century. That's a hugely important statement because what it really does is provide an insight into the nature of Russian revanchism, which is to say it attempts to reestablish control over territories that they held under the Soviet Union. There's a long heritage here with the KGB, and the bottom line, I would say, is that all of the threats that the Soviet Union used to pose to us are still there, or nearly all of them, and in some cases they're actually worse. And what the United States has not been able to do is to shed this Cold War status it had as Russia's main enemy. So this continues to be a serious problem for the United States. What the Russians have done is to adapt intelligence to their circumstances. They've adapted their methods of espionage and covert influence for this century, which is to say they brought it into the information age. I can talk about these agencies later, but the basic story here is that if you are looking for evidence of the effect of cyber attack, you need to look no further than the 2016 presidential election in the United States. I want to give you a heads up. There's a little bit of controversy over this issue because some people say that the Russians had no influence whatever on the outcome of the election. Others who have looked at it more carefully and have looked at the empirical data, and I will talk about some of this a little bit later, can draw a different conclusion. Namely, the fact that the Russians may have tipped the scales in such a way as to have helped Trump come to power in a way that he would not have been able to do had it not been for Russian intervention. So the cyber attacks that we experienced during the 2016 election are essentially of three types. One was covert action, sweeping and sustained political influence operations that blanketed social media. There was also electronic theft that supported covert action, principally the cyber attack on the Democratic National Committee and subsequently the controlled leaks of the DNC emails and other documents on WikiLeaks. And finally, there were attempts against all 50 states to probe to see if they could manipulate the actual elections infrastructure through voter registration and online voting. Happily, there was no success there and no effect. I've mentioned General Gerasimov here, who is credited, along with Primakov, former foreign minister, with this concept of hybrid warfare, where there is a tremendous emphasis on the notion of conquest through cyber attack. In other words, through nonviolent means. The Internet Research Agency, or the IRA, and that's not Irish Republican Army, has been a major player in Russian cyber world, in the intelligence cyber world in Russia. and they were absolutely instrumental in the 2016 elections. I won't go over in detail here what they did, but basically this is not a government organization. This really belongs to the private sector, and Putin could say that it's actually the bad guys that have nothing to do with Russian government that are doing this stuff. Of course, that's simply not true. Actually, 13 Russians, including a number of GRU officers, that's the Russian military intelligence, and three Russian organizations were actually indicted after the Mueller report named them for these criminal actions. One other concept I want to mention here is that when you look at stuff on the internet, let's say Facebook or some of the other social platforms, to the extent that people actually not just read it, but interact with it, we call these engagements or interaction. If they share the content with their friends, or if they click on like it, or they react to it, or send an emoji or a comment along the way, we call that interaction or engagement. And that's actually a metric of how influential postings are. So this is an extremely important idea. Now, there's a tremendous amount of quantitative information here that I just can't give you in detail, but most of it's on the screen. I want to point out that after the 2016 election, Jared Kushner, advisor to Trump, was asked about the impact of Russians on social media during the election, and Kushner just brushed it off. He gave a very dismissive comment that said something like, "Well, there were only a handful of Facebook postings." Of course, that's simply not true. That is actually a fallacious, indefensible statement. With Facebook, there were over 126 million users who experienced receiving Russian postings on social media. Instagram, Twitter also had a very heavy content. And look at the amounts of engagements. If you look at the engagement numbers, you'll see that these were not just posted there. There were actually a tremendous amount of engagement with the postings that the IRA was putting on social media. In YouTube, they uploaded over 1,100 videos, and these weren't the only platforms that they populated with their propaganda. You can see the list of some others. The main point I want to make about this is that every single ad, posting, message, and tweet, and video that was purported to be an American source. Actually, every single one of them originated in Russia, the ones that I'm talking about here, and they were all masked with a U.S. identity. So U.S. users on Facebook and the other social media actually thought that they were reading stuff written by Americans. Actually, they were reading stuff written by Russian intelligence. So you can go through the Facebook ads, the organic postings I'll talk about in just a minute. But the point I want to make here is that just on Twitter alone, it hit more than nearly 1.5 million Twitter users. But with the retweets, the tweets that the Russians posted were actually presented 288 million times. I mean, you can't even get your head around these numbers. And of course, the purpose of all these postings was what the Russians called desinformatia, which is disinformation. It's propaganda. The Russians successfully targeted 3 different groups. This is a very sophisticated strategy. 3 different groups that were using U.S. social media. The right-wing and right-leaning groups. They aimed to generate extreme anger and suspicion. They pushed such themes as voter fraud, illegal participation in the election, conspiracy theories, and Hillary Clinton's attempts to steal the election. In the case of targeting the blacks, there was a very, very specific campaign to do that, and it was all about voter suppression. They basically made the case and a tremendous amount of propaganda about why blacks should not vote. And as it turns out, the blacks did not vote in the same numbers in the 2016 elections as they did in the previous ones. They targeted the left groups in a slightly different way, mainly to get leftists and liberals to vote for any candidate other than Hillary Clinton. So these were very effective campaigns and very sophisticated in their targeting. Just to mention a few examples, I'll just show these visually and not comment on them. But I do want you to see some of these postings in case you haven't seen them. By the way, those of you who saw the Kathleen Hall Jameson presentation last year got a much more in-depth discussion of this. So it's another reason why I don't have to go in depth here. But they stress such things as the border wall, the Second Amendment, gun rights. These were major campaigns of the Russian narrative to generate different reactions from different audiences. I mentioned the organic posts. These are tailored messages that appear on IRA fake pages or user accounts. And if you take a look at the postings on Facebook, infinitely more. I mean, like there was like 3,500 ads, but 67,000 Facebook organic posts. These are very specific, tailored messages to specific people on specific themes, responding to specific issues. Instagram, and look at this, nearly 8.5 million tweets. And so, and the run up to and during the 2016 election, that IRA generated increasing levels of interaction in terms of likes and sharing and so forth. And if you take a look at the interaction, nearly 31 million shares on Facebook, nearly 39 million likes, emojis and comments. It was just a tremendous. It's an extremely disconcerting metric when you're looking at the impact of propaganda. Now, one can say, hey, this is just propaganda. Maybe it doesn't have any effect at all. Actually, it did have a pretty significant effects, and we can explain the Russian success on two levels. One is the way the micro-targeting worked, and secondly, through insider information. Let me just simply say that on social media, you can target ads. You can focus them on very specific areas. For example, 1/4 of the Facebook ads that Russia ran were targeted to specific locations, like the swing states, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. These are all heavily targeted, as were other states that were won by Obama in 2012. Why? Because they wanted to siphon off a lot of the Obama vote. 35 of 50 states in the United States were targeted by the IRA, and nearly a dozen of them were very heavily targeted. So the point here is that Facebook allows the users to target ads based also on congressional districts, and more than that, a feature is that they also will provide feedback to the buyers of these ads about how effective their ads are and how they can refine their ads to get it to have a bigger effect. Now, here's one really important point I want you to know. This is, as you know, a very close election, but Trump won the Electoral College by winning 3 states, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin. If you total up all of the votes in those 3 states, the difference adds up to just 77,640 votes. Those votes cast in the 3 most important swing states actually swung the election. So anybody who says to you, my vote doesn't count, doesn't get it. They really just don't understand the importance of every single vote. That amounted to less than 1% of the votes cast in those 3 states. 0.6% of votes cast in those 3 swing states actually turned the election over to Trump. So we have to say, well, how is it that the Russian intelligence is able to focus on that? Well, here's how. If you read the Mueller report, he gave a lot of emphasis in the Mueller report to this notion of the so-called Trump Tower meeting as evidence of collusion. Well, I think Mueller was off the scent here. There was a meeting that was significant, several meetings that were significantly more important than the Trump Tower meeting, and it was the meetings between Trump's campaign chairman, Paul Manafort, and Konstantin Kilimnik, who was a Russian intelligence officer. They met several times, but a very important meeting happened at the Grand Havana Club just in New York City, just 2 months before the actual election. What did they discuss? Well, they talked about Ukraine and how Trump could help Russia with the Ukraine problem by hiving off much of the eastern Ukraine. And they also talked about the Trump campaign strategy. Manafort provided Kilimnik, let me say this again, a Russian intelligence officer, with very detailed messaging strategy and with internal polling data, and discussed the specific battleground states of Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, also Minnesota and a few others. Now, the point here is that it was not just at this meeting, although we think that was probably the most important meeting, but he had also shared Trump internal polling data months before and months after that meeting. What are the implications? The implications are that the Russians had insider knowledge about how to focus and target very specific attacks on cyber attacks on social media to sway the vote. So we can ask the question, well, did they? Well, as you know from the presentation last year by Kathleen Hall Jamieson, the short answer is yes. She wrote, I think, what is an outstanding book on cyber war, quote, how the Russian hackers and trolls helped elect the president. It's an extremely scholarly and empirically detailed work. But the bottom line is that she explains how the Russian trolls, disguised as Americans, were able to have big effects by magnifying social disruption and divisiveness, how they reweighted the climate of opinion against Clinton and framed the news content. And the bottom line here is that she shows how well the Russians really understood the dynamics of this 2016 election, and how the Russians were so adept at the extensive messaging, and how they specifically aligned their themes, their narratives with the Trump campaign. So in the end, it turns out that white evangelicals and military supported Trump over the summer more than they had before. The Bernie Sanders supporters and blacks didn't vote in the numbers that could have gotten Clinton elected. The same thing was true with the Green Party in two of the swing states that she would have carried if the vote had gone to her instead of the Greens. And finally, I mentioned the voter suppression of the blacks. Black turnout actually was down from past years, and white turnout was up. Her bottom line, with all of these pro-Trump factors at play, it was the late deciders who disapproved of both candidates voted disproportionately for Trump. Now, there's another study. You have not heard the Gunther presentation, but maybe you've read the article. I certainly hope so, but it's in a scholarly journal. I've listed it in my references. Gunther and two of his colleagues are professors at Ohio State University. They're political scientists who actually specialize in voting behavior. They specialize in how elections are won or lost. And there's a simple hypothesis here. Why did so many of the Obama voters in 2012 defect from Obama and not support Hillary Clinton? Basically, Trump won 6 states that Obama had won in 2012. Well, it turns out that just 77%, about 3 out of 4 of the Obama voters in 2012 actually supported Clinton. Well, what happened to the rest? Where'd they go? 10% of them voted for Trump, 4% for minor parties, and 8% didn't even vote at all. Now, I mentioned to you before, this is really important about all of the ads and organic postings. There were a number of very basic fake news themes. They were just lies that the Russians were posting. And let me tell you what 3 of them were, because these became part of the Gunther study. One important theme was that Hillary Clinton is in poor health due to serious illness. Another one was, put your seatbelt on here, Pope Francis endorsed Donald Trump. And the third one was that Hillary Clinton, when she was Secretary of State, had actually approved weapon sales to the terrorist group ISIS, an avowed enemy of the United States. All of these are lies. All 3 of those things are absolutely, totally, 100% falsehoods. But here's what the Gunther study did. They polled people who had voted in the election, and here's what they found. Of those who didn't believe any of those fake messages, 9 out of 10 of them voted for Clinton. Of those who believed only one of those messages, well, only 6 out of 10 voted for Clinton. But of those who believed 2 or 3 of those false messages, less than 2 out of 10 voted for Clinton. You see, the drop-off in support for Clinton correlates directly with believing in fake news. And what the Gunther study shows is that belief in these fake news stories is very strongly correlated, strongly linked to the defection of the Democratic ticket by the Obama voters in the previous election. Well, this is extremely important. So Gunther concludes that for those defecting from Clinton, believing fake news had a greater effect than anything else. And when you go back to the voting toll that I mentioned before, they show specifically how the states of Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, and how those votes total up to 77,000. Again, just 0.6% of the total vote, how that had a decisive impact on the votes cast in those states. And what they conclude is that even a modest impact of fake news might have been decisive. So if you look at the 3 basic studies, Jameson, Gunther, and the Gorodnichenko study, which I have not quoted, what you find here is not just persuasive, but in my mind, compelling evidence that the Russians turned the election in Trump's favor. So if you're looking for an outstanding example of the impact on social media by cyber targeting, this is I think the best case of all. And so you can ask the question, why so? Why has cyber become so important to foreign intelligence? Obviously for the covert influence, and I think I just showed you the most compelling and the most dramatic example of that. They've also used it for intimidation by attacking and taking down much of the infrastructure on the former Soviet state Georgia and Estonia and Ukraine. These were huge, huge cyber attacks on those countries. They use it for digital theft. For example, the Russians cracked into 500 million, let me say that again, 500 million Yahoo accounts, email accounts. Do you know that remains the single largest cyber attack so far in the history of the United States by any foreign power? Was it China? No, it was Russia. We've already talked about the DNC and, of course, the SolarWinds attack, of which I think the damage assessment will probably go on for another couple of years. We should mention ransomwares and damage to U.S. infrastructure, such as Colonial Pipeline and that meat supply house and attacks on the food supply chain. Here's the point about Russia. All three intelligence services, the two that succeeded the KGB, which are the SVR, the Foreign Service, and the FSB, which is the Domestic Service, and the GRU, the Military Service, all three of them are fully aboard, fully armed, and fully engaged in this cyber war against the United States. I should add, it's not just those government organizations, because private hackers and criminal groups are also heavily engaged in attacking the United States, as Biden has pointed out several times, even directly to Putin. So the point here is that the boundary lines between the private sector and the public sector in Russia are extremely blurred, particularly when it comes to cyber attacks. So hackers and criminal groups in Russia, Putin can say, well, I don't have any control over them. They're not part of the government. That is just nonsense. That's an absolute lie. These people and these groups target America with the full blessing, endorsement, and support of the Russian government. Let me turn here, if I can, to China, because China is another very worrisome foreign intelligence power. That's Xi Jinping, who's pictured here, who came up through the ranks of the Chinese Communist Party and government. He's been in charge since 2013. So we call China a near-peer competitor. But the important thing about the Chinese intelligence is this is really a rather different model. It's not your standard old espionage like the KGB or even the new adaptive espionage that we see in the post-Soviet Russia. They have a very different approach. Let's start here with the threats. What are the China threats? And the short answer is major theft, cyber theft of intellectual property, trade secrets, and classified information. And they are motivated to do this because they use it to strengthen the Chinese economy and the Chinese military. And that simultaneously, because it is a zero-sum game in some ways, weakens our own. There's also pro-China covert influence on large swaths of the U.S. youth and general population. And I'll explain this in a moment here. Chinese intelligence has a different approach, and we refer to this as the whole of society approach. And what that basically means is that if you look at this is an important study by Nicholas Eftimiadis. This small sector right here, 16% of that circle is Chinese intelligence. All the rest are different organizations. These are state-owned enterprises. These are private companies. This is the People's Liberation Army, and these are other parts of Chinese society, such as university. So the Chinese, we know that at least 35 universities have been involved in prosecutions throughout the world of Chinese cyber attacks, and there are 7 universities that are very closely connected with the whole cyber enterprise in China. If you take a look at their massive collection effort, they're targeting specifically, and take a look at those 5 bullets here. These are all high technology things of great value to China that they steal from the United States, other countries too, but mainly from the United States. And if you take a look at those things, aerospace and IT, biotech, clean energy, advanced manufacturing, these are extremely important parts of a viable modern economy. Where are they getting it from? Much of it comes from the United States. Now, this is really important because the United States uses intelligence principally for national security reasons, as the Chinese do, but they also mainly use it to provide intelligence support to the economy. The Chinese economy is being built on information that is stolen by Chinese intelligence and provided to Chinese economy. So what they're focusing on developing their own industries and transferring foreign wealth to China. And I would add quickly, they have a lot of support in law. Who's required to support foreign intelligence by law? Answer, all government departments, all private industry, all citizens at home, and even those abroad. If you are a Chinese citizen, even living in a foreign country, you are required by Chinese law to support Chinese intelligence. So this is a very comprehensive legal approach that ensures the full collaboration of everybody, of every important sector of China in supporting Chinese intelligence. Now, what do they target? Well, let's start with intellectual property. They have 200 programs that look like this one. Let me talk about the 1,000 Talents program. This is a program that's designed to recruit high-quality researchers to provide economic and military intellectual property to China. They've already recruited over 7,000 people. By the way, that's a very ambitious target. They started out wanting 2,000. They got 7,000. 3 of them are Nobel laureates. These are really highly qualified researchers, well-published university professors, many in the United States and in other countries. And they seek to conceal their affiliation with the 1,000 Talents program from the United States government. The Chinese provide very, very attractive inducements and incentives to these researchers to help them steal intellectual property. So they're basically doing it not with their own cyber capabilities, but recruiting others to use their capabilities, including cyber, to steal intellectual property in this 1,000 Talents program. They fully exploit the grant system by National Health, the National Science Foundation, Department of Energy, national labs. The good news here, and there is good news, this 1,000 Talents program and others like it are now high on Congress's list and on now finally at long last on the FBI's radar screen. They're also targeting U.S. education. They do this through the so-called Confucius Institutes. These are cultural centers that provide Chinese language training. They turn out to be a main instrument of the Chinese government. They have 500 of these institutes worldwide. More than 20% of them are actually in the United States. The United States is the most heavily targeted country with these Confucius Institutes. The numbers are big, and their basic goal essentially is to create favorable opinion about China and Chinese narratives, including restricting. We have evidence of restricting freedom of speech on the hot button issues for China, which are Tiananmen Square and Tibet, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and I would add more recently the Uyghurs in Xinjiang province. Happily, the United States government has talked to universities about this and is trying to discourage university participation, and they've had limited success so far. The Confucius Institutes operate at the level of universities. The Confucius classrooms operate at the level of kindergarten through grades 1 through 12. They have not had the same significant impact there yet, but that's where they're heading. They're targeting Hollywood. How? Because they are significantly funding major movie making enterprises, and Hollywood realized that there's a huge box office market in China. So basically, a lot of the producers who get Chinese funding are willing to go along. What the Chinese have successfully done is to shape a number of movie plots to treat China favorably, propagandizing U.S. domestic policies, audiences with pro-China themes. So even the New York Times has pointed out that the Chinese are seeking to control the global narrative to present a friendlier, less menacing image of China through the movies. So the point here, also, U.S. actors are either punished or rewarded depending on their cooperation with these programs. The two pictured here, Richard Gere and Sandra Bullock, have been non-cooperative, and they've not agreed to some of the changes sought by the Chinese in movies they're in, and they've been put on the unfavorable list for China, restricted from traveling in China and other things.
Hey, Jim, this is Gary Nelson.
Yes, Gary.
We want to do a couple more slides, and then we've covered a lot of material, and we've got some really good questions to answer.
Yes. Let me do that, Gary, right now. So I'll skip just to indicate video games is an extremely important sector here. It's actually 30 to 50 times larger than Hollywood, and one game called Homefront was initially designed to show Chinese invasion of the United States. The Chinese successfully made it into North Korea instead of China. They've been very successful in their cyber attacks. We can talk about these later: Titan Rain, Operation Aurora, and the Office of Personnel Management data breach, which is really extraordinary. So I'll just summarize China by saying by Eftimiades' study shows that, and his belief that the Chinese intelligence threat may actually be changing the global balance of power. That's hugely ambitious. I'm going to skip over Iran and North Korea for the want of time, and we'll come back to these if there's interest in them in the question and answer. And similarly with the non-state actors, there's an important story on WikiLeaks, and we can also save that for the Q&A. Similarly with the allies and friends. But let me come here and just mention very briefly in summary three major important considerations when we consider the foreign intelligence threat. Let's call them three takeaways. One is that U.S. counterintelligence has got to get better. We got to be at least as good as or better than the threats we face. Mostly, I think this means enhanced countering cyber capabilities. We need both defensive and offensive capabilities. CI infrastructure is important, but I would say countering cyber capabilities must be an important part of what we do in counterintelligence. There's another trend going on in the United States that I'm certain everyone is aware of, and that's the decline of the importance of facts and truth in political discourse. What does this do? This really invites foreign intervention to take advantage of so many of the social and political divisions in the United States. There are huge consequences. I will make an editorial about social media platforms like Facebook requiring more regulation, but I will say that a fractured U.S. public is certainly an inviting target for foreign intelligence services. Finally, here's the bigger issue. It really has to do with the survivability or the viability of democracy. I believe we're at a moment of peril in U.S. democracy. The root causes, of course, I believe are domestic issues, not foreign threats. Yet our problems do invite foreign intervention by dictators and other bad actors who wish us harm. Foreign intervention can further erode democracy and our democratic institutions. And I believe we're at a stage in our national life where effective U.S. counterintelligence may be a key requisite for a viable American political system. Extremely important. And to accomplish that, I believe we need to prioritize counterintelligence and counter cyber capability as a mechanism to provide vital support to American democracy. I do have references that may be of interest, and I'm open for your questions. And Gary, I apologize if I went over by a few minutes.
We do have some questions, Jim. And first on Russia, 2 or 3 questions. Was the Russian disinformation less successful in the 2020 election? And if so, was it because they didn't try as hard, or were we better at blocking their efforts, or were the voters more sophisticated?
Gary, that's an excellent question. I would like to say it was because first of all, the premise is correct. The Russians were slightly less active and certainly less effective in the 2020 election than they were in the 2016 election. Right now, we don't have good evidence about why. We know they did some things differently. They actually ran a number of operations on specific people close to Trump, but the social media presence wasn't nearly as strong. We can speculate, and some of the speculation has got to include the fact that we were very concerned about what they would do in the midterm elections in 2018. And it turns out that what we did, and I do not have detailed information on this, we brought down a number of Russian intelligence servers, including from the Internet Research Agency, on the day of the 2018 elections. It is possible that the Russians were put on notice by our offensive cyber capabilities and conceivably sought a lower profile. I think they might also have hoped that possibly Trump could win this election on his own with less support from them. But of course, in that they were wrong. He was not able to win it on his own. But so right now, all I can say is that we don't have good information to explain why, but we can speculate on that. But we can certainly say that the 2020 elections were less an active, effective target of Russian intelligence than 2016.
There were 2 or 3 questions along the lines of, why is Russia so good at this and we apparently are not? Is it, you might argue, well, the US is such a target-rich environment, or you might argue that we're not trying as hard or we don't know what we're doing.
Well, certainly, you're right, Gary, that we are a target-rich environment. But I want to go back to a slide I mentioned very early in the presentation, and that is that the dictatorships and authoritarian governments have an asymmetric advantage when it comes to counterintelligence. And actually, when it comes to intelligence, and certainly I think that's true in the cyber world, we're fragmented in a lot of ways. For example, if you look at the recent SolarWinds attack by Russia, the United States government has little or no control over the defensive cyber measures that private companies take. So here was a software that was penetrated by Russia. I wish I could say, wish the darn government could have done something about that. But the truth is, that's not in the government's bailiwick. So much of what we need in the way of cyber defense has to depend on the private sector. And I would say even that our cyber defenses in government depend almost wholly on the private sector. So we've been lacking there. Now, another problem is that we do have some offensive capabilities. And I just mentioned the example of 2000, bringing down the Russian intelligence servers in the 2018 elections. We do have these offensive capabilities, but we've been very, very restrained and modest, as far as I know, in using them because it's a highly classified and very, very sensitive area. And the big concern here, and maybe we can talk about it a little bit later, it has to do with escalation control. With nuclear weapons, the nuclear weapons deterrence, we had a much better understanding of deterrence and how an action can cause or stop another action. In the cyber world, we're in a whole new ballgame here. There's just a lot of unknowns, and I think we've been exercising considerable self-restraint in our offensive capabilities, not knowing where this is going to go. So, for example, if we conducted a major attack on Russia, let's say we targeted their infrastructure, we have to be prepared for the idea that they could take down our power grids, they could take down our water supply, and through the colonial pipeline and that meat supply house, they've already demonstrated that they have our infrastructure on their targeting list, and they can certainly do something about it. So the problem of escalation control has been a big issue, and I don't think our government has actually sorted that out yet.
On a specific couple of questions on Facebook. Did they know that the 2016 posts that were coming from Russia? It's not clear. They should have known. It's not, and is it evident that they are being more active in looking for these things now?
Yes, Gary, that's a really, really important question. The short answer is yes, they knew, but they didn't know much. For example, many of the Facebook ads were paid for in rubles, in Russian currency. So there's no mystery. So there's no mystery there, right? So they have to say, "Oh, okay, I see the Russians are buying ads," and I think at that point it was like, it's no big deal, right? It's just no big deal. But much of what the Russians did on Facebook was done in a way that made attribution very difficult, and we really got onto it later. Really got onto it after the election. I don't think we did not have a very good appreciation. Facebook didn't. And I think the U.S. government had a much, much better appreciation, but not nearly big enough. Obama, for reasons that remain to me inexplicable. Well, actually, there are some reasons that I think we can talk about. Did not make a big deal about the Russian intervention in the U.S. election on Facebook and some of the other social media. So I would say we certainly could have done a better job. I don't know that we could have been as effective, and Trump, who is benefiting from this, of course, could have developed another narrative, and that is that the Clinton administration is saying all of this stuff is coming from Russia. Of course, he denied repeatedly throughout the campaign and really throughout his 4-year term that the Russians had anything to do with this, and frankly still denies it. And saying, I accept Putin's explanation that these guys didn't do anything at all. So it was a government lapse. I regard it as a government failure. I frankly regard it as a significant intelligence failure, but it's more of a broad government failure. And I have to say that the results of the 2020 election, in my mind, are somewhat encouraging, because among the reasons that we could speculate for the decline in Russian effectiveness may be the Russian appreciation for the fact, and of course Biden actually talked about this in the campaign, that there will be consequences if you try to intervene in this election. Of course, they did intervene, but not nearly in the same measure that they did in 2016.
Right. A couple of questions on China. because many people, including speakers here, and really including President Biden, have described China as the bigger threat to the United States. The Chinese role in shaping movies and the gaming industry seems troublesome to many of us in the U.S. Can U.S. government do anything as a matter of public policy? This is a public policy seminar forum, so.
I think the government is limited in what it can do forcefully. I think the government is not limited in what it can do in the way of generating awareness of these kinds of Chinese interventions and the consequences of doing so. But I think it would not work if the government went to a particular movie studio and said, "Well, we see that you've changed this movie to reflect Chinese propaganda narratives, and we want you to stop that." You know, the movie producer can look at the government and say, "Hey, screw you! I got freedom of speech here, don't I?" So from the standpoint of taking a hard line, I think the government is restricted by First Amendment limitations, and that's why I mentioned earlier that the dictatorships do have an asymmetric advantage over democracies. But I do think the government, and I'm hopeful that the government is doing something, partly by way of bringing attention to and publicity about Chinese intervention in both Hollywood and in the gaming industry, which really have large consequences. I'm hopeful that the government is going to get very active on that front. But from the standpoint of forcing companies to do things, I think it'd be very hard. I would make one other point here, however. In the case of the 1,000 Talents program, which is an effort to recruit researchers to steal intellectual property, there was a Harvard professor who was recently charged. I don't think he's been prosecuted yet, but charged under a criminal indictment for participating in that program. Not because that program is illegal, but because he lied on his applications for grants that he had no connection with that program. So there are some levers to get into this that are somewhat restricted, but there are advantages nevertheless.
You had a sub point on one of your slides about Taiwan, and there's a concern among at least one of our viewers that Taiwan could be a future global flashpoint. And what can the U.S. do? This may go beyond intelligence, but this is public policy. Do you agree that Taiwan could be a global flashpoint? And
Taiwan could be a global flashpoint. I have to say that I think the Chinese are especially effective at posturing, but I think they've also been very careful. I think the South China Sea is a hugely important strategic issue for the Chinese. They've been engaged in terraforming, which is to say, creating islands and saying these islands belong to China. Therefore, they expand their territorial water zone. So what they've been doing is there's no question that it's aggressive. The question obviously is to what extent would they back it up by force? And I believe the United States and other Western countries are in a position to take a stronger stand on the South China Sea, because I think the Chinese will push as hard as they can on that up until the point that force is required. And I think if push comes to shove, I think they would be reluctant to use force. So I believe that we do have some advantages here to exercise other instruments of power up to and including military shows of force, but obviously short of actual engagement in combat.
Any last words on cyber warfare and one of the main themes of your talk about how the world has changed with social media and with the great capabilities that come because we're networked all together?
Well, Gary, that is such an important issue. I referred to the cyber developments as actually a revolution in intelligence and counterintelligence. And if you look at the history of intelligence, it clearly qualifies that. It's been a fundamental game changer. We're late, I think, in coming to realize the impact and importance of cyber attacks and cyber warfare. I do think that dictatorships, Russia and China, have been ahead of us. By the way, I didn't talk about Iran and North Korea, but they both have good cyber capabilities. They're not in the same league as Russia and China. but we have been latecomers to it. I mean, I think there's no technological reason for it. I think the reasons really have to do with a delayed and belated appreciation for how vulnerable we are, how poor our defenses are, and all the reasons why we really shouldn't be very aggressive in offensive attacks using cyber weapons. I do think that we're waking up, however. I'm very hopeful, partly because of the Biden-Putin summit and partly because Biden actually called Putin, made a telephone call to reinforce his position, which I think is a very important one, clearly articulated, that we're in the game now. We're quite serious about this. And if you continue these cyber attacks, even under the guise of criminals, Russian criminals, that there will be consequences. That is more than just an implied threat to use our offensive capabilities. And in fact, the New York Times actually made the point that this is a very, very thinly veiled threat, that Biden is probably serious about it. And hopefully the fact that the Russians had a much less aggressive posture in the 2020 election, it may mean that they're slowly coming to the realization that we're going to be in this more seriously than we have been in the past.
Okay, thank you. It's a wonderfully intense 1 hour. If people would like copies of Jim's slides, you can write us at seminars@steamboat@gmail.com. That's 2 ats. seminars@steamboat@gmail.com. So thank you very much, Jim.
Thank you, Gary. It's been my pleasure.